Calling any station. This is Capcom. Down and out. Hello everyone, I'm Megan Sullivan and welcome to my new series, Show and Play, where I talk about a video game based on real history while showing you a real object from that time period. For my very first episode, I wanted to talk about the classic NES game 1943, The Battle of Midway. Yes, I know that title makes no sense, but we'll get to that in a minute. And for my object, I wanted to show you guys this. An old Japanese phrase book from World War II that I find fascinating, and I think you will as well. So let's play and learn. If you grew up in the 1980s and 90s like me, you might remember a World War II vertical shoot-'em-up called 1943 The Battle of Midway, in which players fight the Japanese Navy by piloting a Lockheed P-38 Lightning warplane and use all kinds of crazy power-ups to take down enemy planes and ships. This quasi-historical game, developed and published by Capcom, was originally released for arcades in 1987, but was quickly ported over to the Nintendo Entertainment System, known as the Famicom in Japan, the very next year. 1943 was and is a fun and challenging shooter, but one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this game is because it tends to raise a couple of questions, like, why is this game subtitled The Battle of Midway? Didn't the Battle of Midway take place in 1942? And why would a Japanese company develop a World War II game experience from an American point of view? These are very good questions, and I decided to do some research in order to find the answers. 1943 is actually the sequel to an earlier shoot-'em-up by Capcom called 1942, which was in fact loosely based on the Battle of Midway, and was also about an American fighter pilot taking on the Japanese fleet. The game ended up being a success, and so of course Capcom decided to make a sequel. Since the next game took place right after the events of 1942, the development team naturally called the next entry in the series 1943. Now here's where it gets interesting. The full name of the game in Japan is 1943 The Battle of Valhalla, but in North America it was called 1943 The Battle of Midway. Why? Well, perhaps as a nod to the fact that all the planes and ship types in the game are modeled, and in the arcade version also named, after the actual planes and aircraft carriers present at Midway, including Mitsubishi Zeros and the aircraft carriers the Kuga, the Hiryu, the Soryu, and the Akagi. So okay, I guess that answers that, but we're still left with the question of why a Japanese developer made these games in the first place. As history buffs know, Midway was a major turning point in the Pacific theater of World War II, handing the American Navy a much-needed victory over the Japanese fleet. The battle took place between June 4th and June 7th, 1942, and was originally part of a Japanese plan to ambush the American fleet and take over the island of Midway in a bid to extend Japan's defensive parameters in the Pacific Ocean. American codebreakers, however, picked up on the plan, and the Americans were able to come up with a kind of ambush of their own, which resulted in heavy losses for the Japanese, including the loss of 4 aircraft carriers in a single day. It was a stunning defeat, one some argue the Japanese Imperial Navy never fully recovered from, which is why it's a little unusual that a Japanese game studio like Capcom would want to make a World War II series about an American super ace almost single-handedly winning the Battle of Midway and then chasing the Japanese fleet all the way back to Tokyo in order to defeat it. What's going on here? Well, I managed to find a very interesting quote from the game's designer, Okamoto Toshiki, from a 1989 interview which explains Capcom's reasoning. Quote, "Our main goal with 1942 was to make a shooter game that people would have an easy time getting into. That's why we came up with the idea of a World War II setting. Also starting with 1942, we began to take the Western market into account when developing our games, which is why the plane is an American P-38. We had our eyes on the American market. So there you go, the game was initially made for Americans. But what even made me think of a ye-old NES game? Well, that's where my historical object comes into play. It's a World War II Japanese phrase book published in 1943, and although it wouldn't have been used at the Battle of Midway, obviously, I did find out some interesting facts about this type of book that does lead us back to Midway. So let's take a look at it. As you can see, it's pocket-sized, so that it was easy for US soldiers to carry around. It was made by order of the US Secretary of War, George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff. And at the very top it says Restricted, TM 3275 which was the serial number for this particular phrasebook. It then goes on to say War Department, Technical Manual, Japanese Phrasebook, April 15, 1943, which was the date it was published. This book is part of a series of self-study materials and dictionaries that spanned 40 different languages and were published by the Information and Education Division of the Army Services Forces. As you can see, the book is divided by subject matter and has English, Japanese, and phonetic spelling to help you as soldiers sound out the Japanese phrases. But if you've ever studied Japanese, you'll notice something kind of unusual about this book. Instead of using hiragana, the syllabic alphabet most commonly used in Japanese literature today, all the words here are printed in katakana, which is usually reserved for foreign words. Why would that be? Well, there's some interesting history behind this. Katakana was invented over 1,000 years ago by Buddhist monks looking to create a simplified version of Chinese script, which had been borrowed by Japan for its writing system. Shortly after, another simplified and more elegant syllabic script was invented, known as hiragana. Katakana's strong, angular style was preferred by men, while hiragana, with its soft, elegant curves, was preferred by women. Since both the military and government were dominated by men, however, katakana became the standard writing system, alongside Chinese characters known as kanji, for both bureaucratic and military documents. And this would be the case all the way up until the end of World War II. In fact, a 1942 article found in the US publication Tactical and Technical Trends emphasizes how the Japanese military mostly used katakana and not hiragana for its communications. Quote, katakana consists of 50 somewhat angular symbols, which apart from their use on aircraft, are used by the Japanese mainly for transcribing foreign sounds, notices, official documents, telegrams, ship names, etc., etc. Also, fun fact, as you can see in this screenshot, the text in the Japanese version of 1943 is all in katakana, making it look very authentic and militaristic. Now, even before World War II, the Americans knew that katakana was the primary syllabic script used by the Japanese military, and yet Allied forces often struggled to break Japanese Morse code, particularly the code known in the West as J25. The reason is because the Japanese weren't only using katakana to communicate, but were also transliterating letters from the Roman alphabet into hiragana as well, making their codes that much more complex. Ironically, the only reason codebreakers were able to decipher the attack on Midway was because instead of changing their naval code as planned in April 1942, the Japanese ended up pushing the date back to May and then again to June, giving American cryptoanalysts time to decode more of J25 and discover the enemy's plans. Oh, and speaking of cracking codes, if you've ever played 1943 and wondered what the Morse code you hear at the start of the game means, the actual translation is, calling any station, this is Capcom, down and out. In short, the reason this phrasebook is in katakana is because that was the main script used by the military. So that just leaves us with one final question. Did US Marines and soldiers really carry these books around with them? It would appear so, because while doing research for this episode, I came across a later phrasebook from 1944 that once belonged to a US Marine stationed in Iwo Jima during World War II. Pretty crazy, huh? And that's it for this episode of Show and Play. Did you enjoy this episode? Did you learn anything new? Have any suggestions for future episodes? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. See you later!